He was a junior fellow of the Society of Fellows. In addition, he received the MSc degree in economics and politics from King's College, Cambridge, where he studied as a Marshall Scholar. Among other distinctions, he has received the George S. Eccles Prize, awarded annually for excellence in writing about economics, the John R. Commons Award, given every 2 years in recognition of contributions to economics, and the Medal of the Italian State. He has worked extensively on the monetary policy, and that's why we requested him to join us. Today, even earlier, he had spoken to us on the monetary policy. Our second speaker for the day is Professor Jeffrey Frankel. I feel very honored and privileged. When I was at Harvard doing my postdoctorate studies, I used to regularly interact with Professor Frankel, and it was always a great learning for me. He is James W. Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth. He is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He served at the Council of Economic Advisors in 1983-84 and 1996-99 as CA member in the Clinton administration. Frankel's responsibilities included international economics, macroeconomics, and the environment. Before coming to Harvard in 1999, he was professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include currencies, commodities, commodity crisis, international finance, monetary policy, fiscal policy, regional trade, international environmental issues. I had the privilege of attending his classes on the external sector, where he discussed about the current account and balance of payments. I still remember fondly the lunch, every Thursday lunch that we had at the Kennedy School, where he would come and we would chat. Very good learning experience for me. Our third and final speaker for the day, is Laurence Ball. He is professor of economics at Johns Hopkins University. He is also research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a consultant for the International Monetary Fund. That is where I came to know about Professor Ball's work extensively when I was working at the International Monetary Fund. His paper on inflation targeting, countries which adopted it and which did not adopt it, was a seminal paper which used to be discussed at the IMF when I was there. And of course, then I referred to that paper extensively when I was teaching at IIM Bangalore. He has previously been a visiting scholar at a number of central banks, including the Fed Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. His research topics include unemployment, inflation, fiscal and monetary policy, and financial regulations. He is the author of The Fed and Lehman Brothers, Setting the Record Straight on a Financial Disaster by Cambridge University Press. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, who is the member of Niti Aayog. He has kindly agreed to spare time and chat with us and chair the session. He was the chairman of the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare until he took over the responsibility of member of Niti Aayog, and president of the Forum for Strategic Initiatives, which looks at geopolitics. He's been a mentor at TUFICI and a member of RBI Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. He was earlier executive director at the International Monetary Fund, chief economic advisor of our country, and principal advisor. He was at the Planning Commission, and before joining the Planning Commission, he worked at the World Bank for many years. During his tenure, he has worked on a host of economic policy reforms. The major reforms that took place in our country in 1991, he played a very extensive role during that time. He has nearly 100 policy papers, notes, and committee contributions. He has served as member Telecom Regulatory Authority of India and as director and chief executive of another think tank, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. He has published 35 journal articles and 20 book chapters and written over 50 other working papers in areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reform, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. He has published in refereed journals and significantly contributed in policy making, both in the fiscal and monetary area. We have invited him to chair the session today. And with this, I hand over to Dr. Arvind Virmani to conduct the proceedings further.
Thank you, Charan. So, given that Professor Frankel probably has to leave in about 75 minutes, I'll be kind of brief. What I'm going to do is, of course, I should start by saying it's really an honor to have three eminent professionals and scholars participating. So I could not resist the invitation with Charan. I wasn't sure that I'd be available, but I had to make time for this. So it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to chair this session. And of course, Ben is an old friend. He was one of my three thesis supervisors in Harvard, along with Kenneth Arrow and Dale Jorgensen. So we have a relationship going back a long, long time. That kind of, and he was a fresh, if I remember, you had just recently joined Harvard at that time. So we must be more or less the same age. Anyway, so very briefly, of course, a lot of things have happened during the pandemic. Everybody is questioning monetary, fiscal, and other policies. So I just want to very quickly give a little bit of background on what we have been thinking about and doing in India. And then, of course, we will look forward to your own experiences and theoretical framework and discussions in US. And then maybe in the Q&A, we'll come back to some of the issues which are active in India and other developing countries. So very quickly, India historically has been concerned a lot, our monetary policy, we've always been concerned with supply shocks. And that goes back to the time when monsoons were very important, and much of the inflation shocks actually came from monsoon. So whenever we had a bad monsoon, that would translate into food prices and then the propagation of that through the system. So that's kind of the background in which we think of monetary policy. Of course, that is long time back, but in the COVID epidemic at EGROW, we did a number of papers and the first thing we actually emphasize is the dual shock nature of the pandemic, that it was both a demand and a supply shock. So in 2020, when we did these papers, this was a key element of our analysis. Of course, when we looked at the classic case of epidemics, a century or a couple of centuries earlier, much of that related to the labor shock, the supply of labor. But we expected that element to be much lower given the development of vaccines and health precautions and the health knowledge which had accumulated since that time. But the new element which we focused on was the lockdown and the lockdown economics, what effects that would have. So one of the key elements of that again happened to be a simultaneous shutdown of parts of the supply system and of demand. But the element which we focused on was the transition, that when lockdowns were lifted, we expected pockets of excess demand and supply in different geographies and different products. And that's exactly what happened. And this was expected to continue till the system normalized, which roughly we took as going back to 100% of production and demand that prevailed just before the pandemic. Now, what we missed even at that time, I must admit, was that the multiple uncoordinated nature of the waves would mean that this normalization was postponed. So you had this transition period, which because it varied from place to place and for product to product, it propagated much more internationally than than in our papers we anticipated. So that is one of the things which gave rise to this confusion about whether the supply shocks would be temporary, how much they would be temporary, how much before they kind of expired, they would propagate into expectations, etc. So that became an international issue too. And finally, the second element which we kind of focused on very carefully, given our particular situation, was the fiscal monetary coordination. So we analyzed that very carefully. And our analysis suggested that we, at least in India, given our traditional fiscal problems, that we must be very carefully target our fiscal intervention, and also in terms of monetary policy, given our past experience with this monsoon, which I mentioned, be able to target the credit to specific areas of consumers who are suffering, or of particular types of firms which are suffering, which is what we did. So that's just by way of background, to just give an idea of where we are coming from. And with that, let me turn it over to Professor Ben Friedman. I think he has a presentation, so if we can have that presentation.
It's a presentation.
Yeah, okay. We can see it now, Ben. Do you want to make it the whole or just leave it in the middle? It's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Great. Okay.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and let me say that it's a great pleasure to be participating today. I think EGROW is a great development for India and the economics community in India, and I congratulate Charan on having brought this foundation to where it is, and I certainly wish you much success. And I've been honored in the past to speak at EGROW events, and I'm delighted to do it today. And it's a particular pleasure to be here with old friends. As Arvind said, he and I go back, it's embarrassing to say, Arvind, but you and I go back a half a century now to when you were a graduate student at Harvard. Arvind was one of my very first PhD students, and I'm proud of that. And Charan is an old friend as well from when he was visiting in our department. We were delighted to have him here. We keep aspiring, Charan, that one day you will return and spend another year or another semester or whatever you can spare in our department. We are always very happy to have you. So thank you for inviting me to participate, and this is a pleasure. Now, what I plan to speak about this morning is the implications for monetary policy of central banks' current battle against inflation, by which I mean not just ours in the United States, but also central banks around the world. I want to talk about four aspects of the current situation that I think bear on the conduct of monetary policy in a way that is highly likely to carry forward into the future. The first one of those, of course, is the renewed focus on inflation. I think everybody participating in this seminar will be well aware that central banks have come off of a period of perhaps 2 decades, perhaps more, in which inflation has just not been at the top of people's concern. Indeed, to the opposite effect, at least in the central banks of the developed economies, places like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, certainly the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, for some years, the great concern was that there was too little inflation. Now, that, of course, was a great change from what came before throughout much of the period since World War II, but now we seem to be back in the earlier era in which inflation is excessive, and reducing inflation to whatever is the acceptable rate is the primary challenge facing central banks. Now, there are several interesting aspects of this that I want to focus on. First, as we are all aware, in recent years, especially with the absence of any serious inflation, there has been a profusion of work documenting the ever flatter slope of the Phillips curve. I point, for example, to the work of my colleague at Harvard, Jim Stock, but many, many other people have worked on this subject. And I think an interesting issue going forward is going to be whether the Phillips curve is actually as flat as the work of Stock and others suggests that it is. If so, this immediately suggests that we have to point to origins of the current inflation that lie outside of the standard aggregate demand story. But it also has a different implication as well, because if the Phillips curve is flat, then one is entitled to ask what exactly is the point of central banks' effort to contain inflation in the current round by raising interest rates and therefore slowing aggregate demand. Slowing aggregate demand makes sense as a tool for combating inflation only if there is some significant slope of the Phillips curve. And so my prediction is that we will be back in an era in which the slope of the Phillips curve is going to become a primary focus of macroeconomic research in central banks and among those of us who are interested in monetary policy in a way that it has not been for some time. Now, when I say hasn't been for some time, again, pointing to my colleague Jim Stock and many others too, there has certainly been a profusion of research, but it's all been conducted on the basis that, of course, we know that the slope has been becoming flatter, and maybe that's true and maybe it isn't. But I think the subject is going to become of primary importance. In the same vein, I think we are going to see more research on the question of whether inflation expectation surveys are useful predictors of inflation. And here I point immediately to the recent work of Larry Ball, who will speak in a few moments. I think Larry's paper has been an extremely useful contribution. There's also a paper that I associate primarily with Yuri Gorodnichenko, although the lead author on the paper is Michael Weber. And let me also take the opportunity to advertise the work of one of my own students, Carlos Bejar Garcia, who has only just finished a very, I think, very interesting thesis on the subject of the role of inflation surveys as useful predictors. In brief, Carlos's results for the United States suggests that while the short-term Michigan survey is a useful predictor, the long-term Michigan survey is not. And he also, interestingly, finds very little predictive value from the survey of professional forecasters. I'm aware, Larry may want to say something about his own work, I'm aware that this is different from what other people have found, but I thought Carlos's work is very interesting, and I hope that it will get out into the literature before long and people will cite it. Now, the final issue that I want to raise here is one that's economists have had a great deal of trouble getting analytical traction on, and that is the question of what anchors inflation expectations. We would all like to believe that the central bank's commitment to keeping inflation low and the public's understanding of the strength of that commitment play a key role in anchoring inflation expectations. Certainly every central banker would like to believe that, and many actually do believe that, and many of us would like to believe it as well. My own view is that, like many things in life that we would like to believe, having serious evidence to back us up is a different matter. And I think we may be getting into a world in which research is going to tackle this question again. Let me now come to the second issue that I want to raise, which is an enhanced awareness that not all inflation is the same. Economists of my age will remember the entry into macroeconomics of the notion of supply shocks following the actions of the OPEC cartel back in the 1970s. Of course, at some level, everybody always understood that aggregate supply mattered, but before the 1970s and the oil supply shocks, there was almost no discussion of the role of supply shocks. Macroeconomics, after all, was born during the 1930s, a period when there was so much excess capacity that talking about capacity limitations or shifts in capacity limitations simply made no sense. But by the time we got to, say, 20 years after World War II, this was not necessarily true. And then the lack of truth was dramatically demonstrated in the 1970s with the OPEC shocks. Well, I think we're back there again. And one of the most interesting phenomena that I have seen is the difference in the discussion of inflation between the United States and Europe. If you sit in the lunchroom at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, what you will find is that the conversation is almost entirely about aggregate demand issues. If you walk around offices at the European Central Bank, you will find that people are much more focused on things like natural gas prices and some of the shocks that Europe has has suffered. I think this is entirely appropriate, and most analytical work on the subject suggests that our inflation in the U.S. is much more demand caused than theirs is in Europe. Nonetheless, even here in the US, we've had significant supply side influences. And so I think after a period of quiescence on this front, monetary policy is going to be paying much more attention to demand versus supply side forces. And as I think we're all aware, the complications thrown up by supply side shocks are just much greater than those from the demand side. It's not easy for central banks to do what is necessary to contain a demand-caused inflation, but at least everybody understands analytically what's supposed to be done. By contrast, a supply shock, by which I mean an adverse supply shock, presents the central bank with a kind of choice in which neither option is very good, and there's a whole literature of this to which I think we are returning. And here in the US, I think there's an even more fine-grained discussion. Those who listen to Federal Reserve pronouncements are by now familiar with hearing Chairman Powell discuss such niceties as the inflation in what he calls non-housing services prices. Well, I think this is all very interesting, and it suggests once again that a more fine-grained approach to the inflation issue is likely to be there in the future. Let me finally on this topic suggest one idea that seems to me interesting that I have not seen much in the literature, and that is the analogy between the experience that we've been having in the last few years and wars. If I tell you that the economy of a major country that fights a war almost always has a round of inflation, either late on in the war or in some cases after the war, immediately after the war ends, I think this surprises absolutely nobody. We all know this, but I wonder to what extent the episode that we have now experienced with the COVID pandemic and now release from the COVID pandemic is going to turn out to be analytically similar to a wartime experience. After all, the pandemic I think Arvind earlier mentioned interruptions of supply chains, and that's certainly part of it. But I would say they're just massive dislocations of both supply and demand. For a while, demand in the US, for example, was massively diverted from demand for services to demand for goods because nobody wanted to go to restaurants, nobody wanted to go to cinemas, nobody wanted to go stay at hotels, and everybody wanted to sit home and ride on their exercise bicycles. And now that the restrictions have come off, there's this enormous surge of demand for precisely the services that were not where people wanted to avoid before. Well, all of this looks to me like a situation in which demand for armaments all of a sudden grows up, and then after the war is over, all of a sudden aggregate demand shifts away from armaments back toward peacetime activities. So if there are any graduate students in the audience who are looking for good research topics, I will recommend that one. The third subject that I want to take up in evaluating the implications of the current situation for monetary policy has to do with concerns about forward guidance. As I think we all know, central banks have increasingly moved in recent years toward providing the market with what they call guidance on their further activities. I think it's fair to say that most economists have viewed this development favorably. People like me who are skeptical have been distinctly in the minority, but I wonder whether more people will wind up agreeing with me as we move into the future. One reason is that forward guidance acts as a kind of constraint on policy. So to take the key example from the United States, the Federal Reserve made very clear that the ordering of its tightening policies would be the following. First, it would taper its purchases of bonds in the quantitative easing program. Second, only after the tapering, it would start increasing interest rates. And then third, only after it had started to raise interest rates would it move to shrink the balance sheet. Now, I think in retrospect, this led to mistakes. I would at the time have much preferred that they started to increase interest rates earlier than they did. And I would also at the time, even more so, have preferred that they start to shrink the balance sheet earlier than they did. And I think it will take detailed archival research in future years to determine to what extent this forward guidance acted as a constraint on policy, but if it did, I think it was counterproductive. I would also like to point out that in many economies, certainly including the United States, the move away from gradualism in raising interest rates makes this issue of forward guidance as a constraint on policy much greater than it was in the past. In a world in which the central bank always moved interest rates by no more than 25 basis points each meeting, it was easy to persuade yourself that forward guidance didn't limit very much. But now that we have seen central banks' willingness to raise interest rates by 75 basis points per meeting and do that several meetings in a row, we now get to the point at which we have to wonder whether the promise to follow a certain monetary policy path really is a promise that the Fed said that the central bank has to deliver on or not. I also want to point out as a research topic that we do have some evidence that forward guidance increases monetary volatility. I want to point to a research paper by Ehrman and co-authors from the ECB, and also Isabel Schnabel's comments, I think, at the last Jackson Hole meeting. The fourth and final topic that I want to take up is the implications for inflation targeting. And I was very pleased to see that my friend Larry Ball will be talking about this subject as well. This is a topic that Larry and I have been disagreeing on for many, many years, and we are glad to do it again in this group this morning. I would offer three observations on inflation targeting from the recent episode, the most obvious of which is that the Federal Reserve's inflation averaging target is dead, period. It is not coming back. I feel very badly for my former student, Rich Clarida, who led this effort.
Yes, sir, of course, sir.
The inflation target averaging framework that the Clarida effort led to was an answer to a question that no longer exists. So I think that's over. I think the most interesting issue here, in many ways perhaps the most interesting issue we may talk about this morning, is whether central banks will take advantage of the current situation to move the inflation target up from 2% to something higher. People like me certainly believe that 2% is too low a target. I think in retrospect, it is embarrassing how little serious research went into most central banks' identification of 2% as the target, now 15, 20 years ago, whenever most of them did that. But even without relitigating that set of decisions, it's very clear that whatever you thought the inflation target should be 15 years ago, you should pick a higher target today. And there are two reasons. One is that we know that today equilibrium risk-free interest rates are lower than they were 15 years ago. And second, we know more today about the dangers and the costs of getting stuck at the zero lower bound than we knew 15 years ago. So to repeat, you don't have to relitigate the issue of whether 2% was the right choice 15 years ago. Even if it was, you want to be higher than that today. Now, to my disappointment, Chairman Powell has been very firm that the Federal Reserve is going to stick with its 2% target. I think that's unfortunate. And so I am hoping that at least our central bank will engage in what I call, borrowing a term from 15 years ago when the subject had the opposite sign, opportunistic target revision, by which I mean that my hope is that as they get the inflation rate down to something like 3%, they will, in effect, quietly declare victory and withdraw their troops. And after some period of time of 3% inflation, some future Federal Reserve chairman will say, well, we've been at 3% for a while, so let's make that the target. The final issue that I want to raise is one in which I'm not very optimistic. I have always been a skeptic of inflation targeting. Here's where Larry and I disagree. And I think it would be great if one piece of fallout from the current episode is that central banks more generally moved away from inflation targeting altogether. We can go into it later, but this is not the place for me to walk everybody through my concerns about inflation targeting. But my own view is that if a consequence of the current episode is a reduced commitment to inflation targeting more generally, whatever is the number, I think that would be a distinct improvement. So those are my thoughts, and Arvind, I turn it back to you, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussion later. But thank you once again for inviting me. I'm very delighted to have been here.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's very good. You raised a whole series of questions, I think, which most of these are relevant to us. Just a couple of brief, very quick comments. On inflation expectations, actually, the consumer expectation survey we questioned, Charan mentioned when I was on the committee, I really found that ridiculous. It was like 2 or 3 times the actual inflation rate. So in India, we had an even bigger problem. The second point, I think very interesting analogy you're making with the economy of wars and the pandemic. I recall that I started thinking seriously about the demand side when the Chicago port, bunched up. There was this news item in the, I think, Wall Street Journal or somewhere that Chicago port was so busy they couldn't move all the imports into the hinterland, and then following that, the trucking problem. So that's when it came home to me, and I had missed it actually in my earlier papers. I had missed this huge fluctuations in demand. I had thought it would be product-wise and sectoral, but the aggregate one. So yes, that's I think a very important point, and the analogy you've given. Many of us have been wondering about inflation targeting, so maybe Charan will probably come up, have questions on that and comment. So with that, let me turn to Professor Jeffrey Frankel. I think you also have a presentation.
I do. Can everybody see that? Good. Well, I would like to thank EGROW for inviting me to participate in this session. The title of the session is Global Monetary Coordination. I'm going to focus primarily on that. If I have time at the end, I may say a little bit more about inflation targeting, but I do have to leave in 35 minutes. Global monetary coordination. Let me start the story almost exactly 20 years ago in May 2013. And let me just make the point that the only circumstances under which there might be a need for international coordination is if there are spillover effects. What one country does has an effect on other countries, which is likely to be the case. So I want to start the story with the taper tantrum of May 2013. If you'll remember, Chairman Ben Bernanke testified before a House committee that sometime in the future, probably by the end of 2013, quantitative easing would begin to taper off. And the implication was someday, some year in the future, they'd begin raising interest rates. But the Fed did not say it was going to raise interest rates anytime soon. The markets, however, maybe were slightly surprised by this, and market interest rates did rise, particularly long-term interest rates, upon those remarks from Chairman Bernanke. This graph shows, bar chart shows debt capital flows to emerging market economies. The orange bar shows the flows to Latin America, and the blue bars show the flows to emerging Asia. The period up until 2013 was a period of overall net capital inflows to emerging market countries, as it had been mostly since the turn of the century, or since 2003, with an interruption by the global financial crisis. Well, when Bernanke made his statement about the tapering and U.S. interest rates rose, capital flows turned around. Investors who had gone abroad, or to, in many cases, to emerging market countries in search of higher yield, came back to the U.S. and the advanced countries in anticipation of increases in interest rates. So you can see the flip from positive capital flows to negative capital flows. Well, not coincidentally, this was a period that led to calls for international monetary coordination. And I particularly want to highlight here Governor Raghu Rajan of the RBI, who immediately after the tapering began in January 2014 said, in part, international monetary cooperation has broken down. The U.S. should worry about the effects of its policies on the rest of the world. And it wasn't only he who was concerned about this. At the subsequent G20 summit meeting in Brisbane, Australia, the Brisbane Action Plan stated, nobody remembers this now, but stated we are determined to step up our cooperation to provide significant new momentum to the global economy, boost demands and jobs. So these were calls for monetary coordination or macroeconomic coordination across countries. I'm going to talk about coordination as game theory, just a little bit of light theory in here, because economic theory has a quite specific definition of what coordination means or cooperation. Coordination is defined as an agreement to set policies jointly in such a way that the participating countries, which in a game theory context would be called players, are better off under the complete package of policy changes than they would be in what's called the Nash non-cooperative equilibrium, where each player takes the policies of the others as given. So what I'm going to do primarily in my 15 minutes here is apply game theory to recent macroeconomic history. And it's important to realize that there are different games that countries could be playing. I'm going to talk about three: the exporting unemployment game, the currency war game, sometimes called competitive depreciation, and competitive appreciation game. I consider each of the three in turn. Let's start with exporting unemployment game. This is a game where the coordinated equilibrium that leaves everyone better off involves joint fiscal expansion, a classic case of coordination. So when the countries are not cooperating, when each one is taking what the others are doing as given, each country is tempted to hold back because they care not just about growth and employment, they also care about their trade balance. And they're worried, each country is worried, that if it increases government spending or cuts taxes, it'll worsen its trade balance. And so for that reason, it holds back a bit on fiscal stimulus. And as a result, there's a deficiency of demand globally, because everybody's trying to do this. Of course, it's not possible for every country to improve its trade balance because they have to add up to zero. And so you're left in an equilibrium with low growth and employment. And the classic example of this would be the 1930s, the Great Depression. So on this view, coordination offers a solution, sometimes called the locomotive theory. The solution is that countries agree, I'll increase my fiscal spending if you increase yours, and the world is then pulled out of recession. The original idea was that the US, Germany, and Japan would be three locomotives pulling the economy out of recession. Two historical examples: the Bonn G7 summit in 1978, and the very first of the G20 leaders summits, which took place in the first one in 2008, the second one in 2009. The G20 meetings were elevated to this leaders level at the suggestion of the British Prime Minister in response to the global financial crisis. And one could argue that each of these were examples where countries agreed to undertake fiscal expansion with mixed success, some success, increasing demand. So this is a 2x2 chart to illustrate what I mean by this game, the exporting unemployment game, or the locomotive game. On the each row represents a policy choice by Europe. Assume that there's only two countries, but that's just for simplicity. We could have 20 countries. Europe tightens fiscal policy, hoping that the demand will come from the rest of the world and that it won't have to experience a trade deficit in order to experience an increase in economic activity. But the US has the same incentive, which is to hold back on fiscal policy, trying to improve its trade balance. And the result is you get this non-cooperative equilibrium, sometimes called beggar thy neighbor or exporting unemployment. Nobody succeeds in improving their trade balance, but the world ends up in recession. In this case, cooperation, which is going to be that green arrow, consists of Europe agreeing to expand fiscally if the US agrees to expand fiscally. And if they both stick to it, You get this cooperative locomotive outcome. Nobody achieves a trade surplus, but higher spending globally lifts all boats, and you have stronger output and employment. And I'm representing that by the locomotive. And as I said, the G20 meetings in response to the global financial crisis could be interpreted along those lines. Okay, you might think you could make a similar case for cooperative joint monetary expansion, and people have. Raghu Rajan's specific complaint in 2014 was that the Fed was in the process of switching to a tighter monetary policy, and that this, without consulting other countries, and that this would hurt other countries by holding back growth. In this view, coordination would consist of agreeing to keep money easy, keep interest rates low, keep quantitative easing in action. Monetary policy differs from fiscal policy among other ways, and it's that its effects on trade are ambiguous. On the one hand, yes, it's true that when the Fed cuts interest rates, for example, which it did in response to the 2020 pandemic, faster U.S. growth will pull in more imports and will help stimulate economies in other countries. So that does go in that direction. But on the other hand, there's a tendency, and this had happened, for the dollar to depreciate in response to U.S. monetary expansion, which makes it harder for producers in other countries to compete with U.S. producers. So that goes the other way, and the net effect on the trade balance is ambiguous, and the net effect on other countries' growth is ambiguous. Go on to next game, the competitive depreciation game, also called currency wars. From 2003 onward, the U.S. complained that China was keeping its currency, the renminbi of the yuan, unfairly undervalued, and similar complaints against some other countries, particularly in Asia. 8 years later, it was the turn of the U.S. to be the target of complaints about unfair devaluation. Brazilian leaders in 2010 coined the phrase currency wars. They complained at the Fed, and soon enough subsequently the Bank of Japan and the ECB had exceeded excessively. This was a period of QE2 in the case of the US. Very easy monetary policy because of the still low, not full recovery from the 2008-2009 global recession. So the Fed definitely was following easy monetary policy. And the Brazilians said that this was in an effort to depreciate the dollar, or in the Japanese case, to depreciate the yen, in an attempt to improve its trade balance. And Brazil said that this put upward pressure on other currencies, like its own currency, the real, and hurt its exporters. This was an old story. Competitive depreciation goes back also to the 1930s. It was deemed to be particularly acute, the problem, because during this period, we were up against a zero lower bound. The Fed and the ECB and the BOJ and the Bank of England couldn't reduce interest rates any further. In the case of the Fed, they couldn't reduce it below zero. In the case of the others, they got a little below zero, but not too far. So if you're deprived of the ability to stimulate the economy, domestic economy, through low interest rates, one of the other channels open to you was to depreciate the currency. And this was thought to sharpen the problem of competitive depreciation. Well, under this game, the cooperative solution is to refrain from competitive depreciation. One solution is structural, is to adopt fixed exchange rates. This was said to be one motivation behind the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, that the post-war monetary system would feature fixed exchange rates. The motivation was the perception that in the 1930s, countries had participated in competitive devaluations against gold and therefore against each other. And of course, everybody can't devalue against everyone else. And the perception was this left everyone worse off. And in a desire not to repeat this mistake, the Bretton Woods delegates agreed on fixed exchange rates in the post-war period. Here's a competitive depreciation game, or the currency wars game, in the 2x2 graph. First, Japan pursues expansionary monetary policy to depreciate the yen, and this was the key plank of Abenomics when Abe became prime minister. And the US at the same time, or actually in this example I'm giving of 2010, the US did it first, pursues expansionary monetary policy. It's in an effort to stimulate their economies in part by depreciation and improving the trade balance. But of course, you can't do that collectively. And so you end up with this non-cooperative equilibrium deemed a currency war by the Brazilians. And I'm representing the currency wars by this cannon firing some coins out there. It's the non-cooperative equilibrium. Nobody achieves depreciation. Nobody achieves an improvement in the trade surplus, but you end up with overly expansionary monetary policy globally. Well, if this is the game, coordination or cooperation consists of everyone agreeing to pursue monetary discipline. If Japan holds back on monetary expansion and the US holds back on monetary expansion, we get a superior cooperative equilibrium where everyone agrees to refrain from currency warfare. And actually, little known, the G7 countries did agree to do this in 2014 or 15, to agree particularly from intervening to push their currencies downward, which is an agreement that is held up until this date. Well, the third and last game I want to talk about is a competitive appreciation game. It's just the flip side of the competitive depreciation game. And here's where we get bringing things up to date. In 2022, as we've heard from Ben, and as we all know, the priority shifted to fighting inflation, which exceeded the targets. And even though we already know this, I'll show you a graph here. We have the US inflation is the red line. The euro area inflation is the yellow line. Here's a sample. Emerging market country, Brazil, is the green line. And the median country among the set is the blue line. This is from most recent World Economic Outlook. And with the target of 2%, which for better or worse has been the target for the US and Europe essentially, or even for the higher targets that some emerging market countries set, we're all pretty much all above that target now. So the priority has shifted to fighting inflation, and concerns about trade deficits have faded. The US, even though we have a very large trade deficit now, for some reason it's not much of a political issue, not much focus on it. Well, of course, the Fed and others raised interest rates in 2022 and continuing this year to fight inflation. The US raised interest rates more than Europe did, and Japan hasn't started doing it at all. The result, as expected, is that the higher interest rates make US assets more attractive, capital inflow, dollar appreciates, and the result is exporting inflation to other countries, particularly in the form of higher commodity prices, which we know in the US that commodity prices have been higher, but in other countries with other currencies that have depreciated against the dollar, which is most of them over the last year or two, commodity prices, oil and other commodity prices have gone up even more, food, than in the US. So the US is in effect is exporting inflation to other countries. And other countries have complained about this property of the dollar. So this has been called reverse currency wars. In a reverse currency war, each country raises its own interest rate, hoping to appreciate its currency and reduce inflation back towards its target. And in the non-cooperative equilibrium, global interest rates are too high. No one succeeds in reducing, putting downward pressure on import prices because you can't all appreciate against each other. But you do end up with the equilibrium in which world interest rates are too high. And the biggest victim of this are the bystanders, the emerging market economies, particularly those that have large dollar-denominated debts, who lose because interest rates are high, precipitating tighter financial conditions globally, but also lose because the dollar appreciates, and if their debt is denominated in dollars, that hurts their ability to service that debt. Well, if this view is correct, the gains would be to cooperation would be to moderate the increase in interest rates. I think I've probably used up my time. So here's a paper, International Coordination, where I sort of survey all these issues. And hope there's time for a Q&A and to discuss IT. Well, let me add a word about IT. How am I doing for time, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Just as Mr. Virmani mentioned, India and other emerging market and developing economies tends to be more subject to supply shocks than advanced countries are. In India, there is traditionally the issue of the monsoon, which he mentioned, but it's a general property that developing countries are more vulnerable or experience more productivity shocks, more weather events, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on. And inflation targeting is a problem. If you're committed to a given inflation rate and then you have a supply shock, adverse supply shock, it's reflected entirely in a loss in output if you committed to avoiding an increase in the price level, increase in the inflation rate. You don't want a supply shock to take entirely the form of a decrease in output. So I'm one of many who have suggested that nominal GDP targeting would be superior to inflation targeting. And I have a paper co-authored with Pranjal Bhandari that argues that for a country like India, nominal GDP targeting would be better than inflation targeting because it gives you the same desirable conditions, plus it's not vulnerable to supply shocks. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's very useful. Yeah. That's something worth thinking about. You just reminded me, I think, very well that one of the kind of simplistic solutions, where the way I used to think of it when I was CA and before that was how much to accommodate the supply shock, whether it was an oil shock for us because we import something like 75 to 85% of our oil. So in the old days, the monsoon used to be very important. Then in later years, the oil price has become very important. So the question, one way I used to think of it from the ministry was how much of it should we accommodate and how much to tighten. So yes, but I think that's a useful suggestion which we should definitely consider, the nominal GDP targeting. Thank you. Okay, with that, let me turn to our last speaker, Professor Laurence Bell.
Great. Let me try to share my screen. Let's see. Can you see my slides?
No.
No? Okay.
It came earlier, but it went off.
Okay, so it says connecting.
Okay. Maybe it got disconnected.
It all says.
Thought I saw it earlier, right? Charan, did you get a flash?
Yeah, we saw it. I think he'll just bring it back. Otherwise, Vivek will do it.
Okay, let me try one more time. Share. Still says connecting. Let me try one more time. Click on share, worked before. Click on screen. Oh, wait, how about this?
Okay, yeah.
Got it, okay, all right. Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this very, very interesting session. Let me get right to the point. I will make a few general comments about inflation targeting and then try to apply them to India. So again, getting straight to the point, I guess unlike both Ben and Jeff, I'm going to take basically a positive view of inflation targeting, at least in the weak sense that it's good for central banks to have a numerical inflation target and to announce it and have policy centered largely on keeping inflation near the target, although there are lots of details about the best way to do that. It always seems to me that there's kind of a logical proof that optimal policy involves inflation targeting, based on assumptions that nobody could argue with. And the proof in my mind goes this way. So first of all, suppose you're a policymaker running monetary policy. You should have in mind what you think is a reasonable range for inflation. You don't want inflation to wander off arbitrarily high or become arbitrarily negative. So you should think through what's an acceptable range for inflation. So that's point number one. Point number two is if you have an acceptable range, that range has a midpoint. Again, I think we can't argue with that. And if you want inflation to stay within the acceptable range, you should generally try to keep it towards the midpoint of the range. Because if you're always at the edge of the range, then with shocks to the economy, you're likely to be pushed to unacceptable levels of inflation. All right, so if you're a policymaker, you should have a midpoint of a range, essentially an inflation target. Now, in practice, at most central banks, policy is made by a committee. If you have a committee of policymakers, it's a good idea for them to tell each other what their ranges and midpoints are, and if they disagree, to try to work out some compromise so they all have the same inflation target they're aiming for. Obviously, if you have a policy meeting and you are discussing what to do about interest rates, and one policymaker is trying to target 4% inflation and one's trying to target 6% inflation, you won't have a very productive discussion. So the policy committee should get on the same page about what inflation rate are we aiming for. And then the last step is that if policymakers have agreed on what inflation rate they're aiming for, they should announce that publicly. There's the concrete benefit that if the public understands what the inflation target is, that can help to guide inflation expectations and make it easier to achieve the target. There's also just the idea that in a democracy, central banks should be transparent. Public inflation targeting is better than secret inflation targeting. So, that's the line of reasoning, which in my mind says a well-functioning central bank should announce an inflation target. I might say, by the way, that publicly announcing a target is not essential for good policy in some circumstances. So, for example, the US announced a formal inflation target only in 2012. And in the 2 decades before 2012, policy had been doing just fine. But I think that's because there was an implicit target. The Fed had not announced 2%, but policymakers were adjusting policy in a way that suggested they were trying to achieve 2% inflation target. And people came to understand that. Greg Mankiw used the term covert inflation targeting or stealth inflation targeting for what the Fed was doing in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that's okay if everybody implicitly knows there's a 2% target. I think, though, in the case of India, for example, before the announcement of the target in 2014, 2015, it was very unclear what, if any, inflation rate was being targeted. There was a lot of confusion about monetary policy. So formally announcing a target in India's context, I think, had substantial benefits. Okay. So central banks should announce an inflation target. However, and this is very important, hitting the target should not be the only goal of policy. So to state the obvious, output and unemployment also matter for economic welfare. and monetary policy affects those variables as well. You can imagine a world in which there's a certain inflation target and policy is very successful at keeping inflation close to the target, but there are frequent recessions and unemployment is high. That would not be a well-functioning economy. So optimal policy should seek to do a pretty good job of keeping inflation near the target, while also seeking to do a reasonably good job of stabilizing the real economy. Now, people who argue for strict versions of inflation targeting, where really hitting the target is the sole or primary objective, sometimes make the argument that, well, in the long run, monetary policy affects inflation, but in the long run, policy is neutral. It doesn't affect output or employment. So if we have a sole focus on inflation, maybe that's not quite optimal for minimizing short-run fluctuations in output and employment. But in the long run, monetary policy doesn't really matter for those variables. So let's just focus on inflation and we'll get the long run right. I think that is a badly flawed view because of the phenomenon known as hysteresis, that if because of an excessive focus on inflation, policy allows output to be sluggish and unemployment to be high for a sustained period, that can leave long-term scars, and there can be permanent or very persistent harm to the real economy of not having policy focus on stabilizing the real economy as well as inflation. So I think it's dangerous to have a single mandate for just hitting an inflation target. And an obvious example where this is relevant is the European Central Bank, which does have a single mandate for price stability. I think at times, at least, the ECB has really taken this literally, and policymakers have said, well, our only job is to achieve price stability, defined as keeping inflation close to 2%, and that's all that matters. And I think that's had deleterious effects. So I've always been struck by this quote now from 12 years ago. So 2011, the European Central Bank was getting some criticism for its policies, and President Trichet made the statement that I quote here. And basically, his point was our mandate is to have 2% inflation, and for the last decade, inflation has been very close to 2%. So we've done our job, full stop. We should get congratulations for meeting our mandate. As you probably all recall, that was a period of very high unemployment in the euro area. I think at least in part because of not enough attention by the ECB to employment. And so I think it's very dangerous to have a monetary regime where where the real economy is ignored. All right, moving along. So the lesson is inflation targeting is a very sensible framework, but it should be flexible in a way that allows policymakers to try to achieve reasonable outcomes for employment and output. Now, getting to India, I am not nearly as much of an expert as many people I'm speaking to about India's monetary policy, so I want to be cautious. But as an outsider, I would say India's policy regime looks like a pretty good framework for flexible inflation targeting. One that has targeting, but is flexible enough to achieve other objectives as well. So, as I'm sure you all know, the official policy of the RBI is to conduct policy with the primary objective of maintaining price stability, but growth is explicitly mentioned, so that's good. Actually, if I were writing the statement, I might even take the word primary out of the word, out of the phrase. But it's important that growth is mentioned as an objective. Also, of course, there's a target of 4%, but a fairly wide range around 4%, giving the RBI substantial leeway to allow some movements in inflation if that's necessary for good outcomes for output and employment. I think there's even more leeway because when inflation gets outside of the range, and I guess recently it's been slightly above the top of the range, it's not the case that policymakers are lose their jobs or put in jail or anything like that. They have to write a letter explaining the situation and what they're going to do to bring inflation back into target. But again, I think there's some flexibility in the policy. And then finally, and here's a point where I definitely agree with Ben Friedman about the level of the inflation target. We don't know scientifically exactly what the optimal inflation rate is, but 4% seems pretty reasonable, much more reasonable than the 2% level adopted by most advanced economies. As Ben described, 2% is too low, basically because of the problem of the zero bound on interest rates. 4% is better from that point of view, and is still low enough so that it's a level of inflation below the level at which, as far as we can tell, there are adverse effects of higher inflation on growth. All right, just to try to finish up fairly quickly. So again, it seems almost like common sense to me that, of course, it's good to have an inflation target, that's a sound regime for policy. I read some things by economists and policymakers in India who are opponents of inflation targeting. And my sense is not so much that they point out terrible drawbacks of targeting, as the argument is, well, inflation targeting hasn't really helped all that much. And in my reading, some of the critiques of inflation targeting hold the regime to too high a standard. So it's not the case that just because you announce an inflation target, suddenly the basic trade-offs facing policymakers become much less severe and the economy enters a wonderful new period of prosperity automatically. In particular, and again, others, in this session know more than I do, but I have the sense that, the design, the advantageous disinflation that occurred around 2014, 2015 was due to a variety of factors, lower energy prices and so on. I have one citation of an interesting paper on this. And, the mere adoption of an inflation targeting regime, was not something that automatically led to inflation falling and becoming more stable. I think to some degree, India has had good luck in that an inflation range of 2 to 6% was adopted at a time when inflation was already heading in that direction. In countries in which inflation targeting has been introduced with actual inflation well above the target, there's generally been a painful price to pay in slowing the economy and bringing inflation down to the target range. Inflation targeting is not a miracle cure, but again, as we discussed before, it seems like a very sensible, rational way to run policy. And there is the concrete benefit, and I have another citation on an empirical study on India, that it helps to anchor inflation expectations, that since inflation targeting is started in India, expected inflation is less responsive to short-run movements in actual inflation, and that's desirable for keeping inflation stable, and monetary policy doesn't have to move as aggressive and destabilize output as much to stabilize inflation. Finally, and I'll be brief on this, again, broadly speaking, inflation targeting is a sound policy. There are many operational details. Let me just mention one, and this is related to the last thing Jeff Frankel talked about, what inflation rate should be targeted. should it be the headline inflation rate or some measure of core or underlying inflation? And briefly, I tend to favor the idea of targeting some core or underlying inflation rate, basically for the reason that Jeff pointed out. If you're obsessive about keeping headline inflation very stable, then if there's a supply shock, you have to tighten very much to offset the supply shock, and that's not optimal. Whereas focusing on core inflation allows policy to look through some transitory shocks. The Eichengreen paper that I mentioned before makes the point that, well, if you allow headline inflation to change too much, that can feed back into expectations, and expectations become less anchored, and maybe that's undesirable. So there's some trade-offs there, but there's a lot to be said targeting core inflation. And then let me basically stop. There's a question of how to best measure core inflation, and I want to plug the idea of using the weighted median inflation rate rather than the traditional measure of inflation rate excluding food and energy. And just because of time, let me stop there. We can come back to that in the discussion, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, before I ask for questions for Professor Frankel, if he's still there, I think the way you have put it, it addresses many of the issues. So just let me tell you from my personal experience, when the proposal was originally meted, and I was, on the committee which was to first make this proposal, I objected to inflation targeting, and they changed it to flexible inflation targeting. The final report said flexible inflation targeting, but once Raghuram Rajan became the governor and implemented it, I think they followed not just primary, but inflation as the sole objective. And that's where I think it went wrong, because it led them to over-predict inflation. This is the time when Sharon mentioned that I was actually on that advisory committee, and I used to say that your inflation forecasts are wrong, and some of the reasons you already pointed out, the oil prices were declining, etc., which are very important in India. And the result of that over-prediction was they tightened too sharply and really had a negative effect on the growth rate. Generally, tightening doesn't result in usual the developed country type of decline in GDP, but it affects the growth rate in India. So that was the issue there. But you're right with the framing which you have given, where both inflation and output have a role, and you have a target which is reasonable, etc. I think I personally would have no serious problem with that suggestion. Okay, so let's, while we have Professor Frankel, if there's somebody who wants to ask him a question, let's take one or two questions.
Sir, what is the process of that, sir? UAV.
Hey, hold it. You have to raise your hand. Who is talking? You have to either raise your hand. I think I'll give first. Charan wants to come in because he maybe wants to ask some questions. Charan, go ahead. Dr. Charan Singh.
Professor Frankel, we have been looking at your work. I totally agree with the suggestion that you made on targeting nominal GDP. I think that makes sense. The other thing, so I would be of the view that in India, we had minted multiple indicator approach during the Asian crisis, where inflation was one of the 6 indicators. The other were, of course, the fiscal indicators, the financial sector indicators, the external sector indicators. What would be your thought? Should India, now that we have the statistical techniques and tools, we have the sophisticated measures, we could target multiple indicator approach rather than the nominal GDP?
Yeah, go ahead. If you have some response, otherwise we can.
Yes, I had to unmute. Thank you for the question. If you target everything, then I suppose you're not targeting anything. So we assume that central banks look at all kinds of indicators and variables that they're interested in. The whole trend over the last 20 years or so has been towards greater transparency and communicating your intentions to the public. And to do that, you have to keep things relatively simple. I agree with Ben Friedman that he said about forward guidance, that there's a problem that you semi-commit to a target that you then regret later on because things have changed. But some degree of commitment, not even commitment, but some degree of guidance to the public that this is what you're aiming for makes sense. Larry Ball made a case for inflation targeting that it's reasonable to have number in mind for inflation. It's reasonable to talk about it. It's reasonable to share that with the public. I don't disagree with that, but I would like to share a target for nominal GDP at the same time, or a projection. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee has this thing called the SEP, Survey of Economic Projections. They say what they anticipate inflation being over the next year or two, what they anticipate growth being, and a number of other variables. I just want to add a very minimal suggestion for the Fed and other central banks: add nominal GDP growth as one of the variables that you say, and that way, if you do have a supply shock, you don't have to give up your projection, your target. You can keep your semi-commitment to meet that. So that's the argument for nominal GDP targeting that I make for India in this paper with Pranjal Bhandari.
Mr. Chairman, can I quickly ask one more question?
Please.
Professor Frankel, you did recognize in your talk about the supply side shocks, and I really like the way you analyze that the emerging countries, especially like India, are more prone to supply side shocks than the advanced economies. The question that I had in mind was the interest rate instrument is more for the more appropriate tool for the demand side. For the supply side, would you agree that the fiscal side can play a better role than the monetary policy?
Well, monetary policy can't do anything about the supply side, about terms of trade shocks, or can't prevent them, or monsoon shocks or productivity shocks. I'm not sure that fiscal policy per se can do much about it in terms of the level of overall fiscal stimulus, can do much about the supply side either. But fiscal policy has a lot of details, of course. It doesn't matter. It doesn't only matter whether you increase spending, but it matters what you increase spending on. And it doesn't only matter whether you increase or decrease taxes, but it matters what you tax, and that you have a more efficient tax system. And I think increasing the efficiency of government policy, both on the tax side and the spending side, in India and the US and every country, is a way of improving the supply side and achieving longer term growth without having to suffer inflation.
Okay, Ben, do you want to now come in and respond to some of the points made by Professor Bell, or the questions raised? You're muted. Unmute.
I don't have any criticism of Jeff Frankel's presentation. I found it very interesting. And in looking, I guess on inflation targeting, I suppose the gap between Larry Ball's view and mine is less than I might have thought. Larry, it's interesting, you point to this bizarre statement by Jean-Claude Trichet in 2011. I have a paper that was published in 2008, which was an eerie anticipation of that. I have a paper in which, as something of a joke, I started the paper with a fictional vignette of the chairman of the Federal Reserve appearing at one of these hearings before Congress at a time in which the economy is basically, it was basically taking the figures from the 1930s. GDP is down by a third, industrial production is down by a half, banks are failing by the thousands, and so forth. And in this fictional vignette, I have the chairman of the Federal Reserve, whose name is Mr. Milton. You can get the illusion, saying that he has come to accept the congratulations of the congressmen and senators because over the past 12 months, inflation has averaged 1.9%, which is only a tenth away from the 2% target. And the vignette goes on in that vein. And I thought I was writing fiction. And lo and behold, 3 years later, Jean-Claude does it. And as you point out, at a time of super high unemployment in all these countries in Europe, Jean-Claude was looking for the congratulations of of whoever. So I thought this was what's the statement about reality imitating art?
Great.
Hang on for a second. To be fair to
Yeah.
Jean-Claude Trichet, he said correctly that was the mandate he was given. Now
That was right. That was the mandate he was given. But I think it shows the foolishness of the mandate. Now, where do I differ with Larry? Because I think I still do. My view is that the people who wrote about inflation targeting years ago were right in pointing out that if there is a target about which the central bank is able to be quantitative, then they will be held to that and they will be deemed responsible. And so my view is that in a world like the United States, where we have a dual mandate for both price stability and maximum sustainable employment, to have a numerical target for one of these objectives, but not the other, inevitably skews policymakers to favor that objective. And therefore, my view is that we should either, for all the reasons Larry said, we should either have explicit numerical targets for both the price and the real side of the objective, or we should have a target for explicit numerical target for neither. And I point out that while Jeff and Larry have talked in terms of a target for nominal GDP, if you have a target for prices and you also have a target for nominal GDP, then for people who know how to subtract, you have a target for the real side. So that gets pretty close. But my real objection is to having a target for the nominal side, but not the price side, but not the real side. And I think Larry's reporting of Jean-Claude's statement, which again is to me eerily similar to what I thought was a comic vignette I was writing 3 years before, really makes the point very well.
Thank you. My understanding, this is not, sorry, Professor Ball, you want to respond?
Just comment on that briefly, because I mean,
Yeah.
Ben, I think, is making a fair point that that's a danger, that if you quantify one goal and don't quantify the other, that's going to tip you towards emphasizing measuring performance on the one you can quantify. Now, I mean, having said that, there are good reasons why you would, even if you care about both, you would quantify one and not the other. It's possible to quantify an inflation target because the central bank really can, in the long run, hit whatever target they want, whether they can choose 2.0 or 2.3 or 3.15, and that's an achievable target on average over time. You know, when you talk about a target for employment or output, it's hard to estimate what's the sustainable level of employment or output. That changes over time. You know, so it's just not possible, you know, to say unemployment is going to be a certain level on average over time. You know, that would have to be adjusted. So, you know, and I would lean towards quantification is good. So quantify what you can, don't quantify what you can't, but just be very vigilant. I don't know whether anybody. It was very interesting to see Elizabeth Warren questioning Jerome Powell a few weeks ago. Giving him a very hard time about not paying enough attention to unemployment. I think we need to build into the system a lot of concern about paying attention to output and employment. But again, I think there are benefits. And again, in terms of inflation, there is this role of inflation expectations. That there's not an analogous role of unemployment expectations. So actually having everybody really on the same page about what number we're trying to get for inflation, I think has benefits for stabilizing inflation. But I agree. I think any differences from Ben are somewhat matters of nuance. I agree 100%, by the way, about the idea of when inflation gets down to 3 or 4%, not going any further, and at some time in the future, announcing a change in the target.
Okay, great. I think we have a large consensus. Charan, did you see any good questions in the chat box, or?
So there are many good questions, but I think we will not have time because everybody.
Yeah, we are running out of time.
Badly running out of time. But I have a very quick question listening to all the three, and that is, given the differences in advanced and emerging countries, given the markets are fragmented, given the difficult challenges in planning, would inflation targeting be the right instrument for an emerging country?
I think.
Thank you very much for.
Yeah, sorry. Panel. Yeah, go ahead. Frankel, Professor Frankel? Yeah.
I'm leaving right now. I'm very sorry.
Yeah,
I think, as I said, nominal GDP targeting, which has been talked about so much for advanced countries, would, if anything, work better for developing and emerging market countries. That's my view.
So in a way, we've discussed it, but I think one of the things which is not entirely clear is how inflation expectations affect future inflation, because as I mentioned, in India, the consumer expectations seem totally unrelated to anything that happened before or after. And so if I remember seeing some presentation from the US, where the expectations seem to be dependent on certain selected products or services, like 1 or 2 or 2 or 3. So it's a very, so that part of it I'm still not clear, but maybe in a future discussion we can get into that.
So with the transmission lags too,
transmission lags we've not discussed, but then okay, so I think we've gone well over our time limit. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers, and for the listeners who've been very patient. I think Dr. Kurian and others wanted to ask some questions, but we just don't have the time. So thank you, and over to you, Charan.
Again, paucity of time, so I'll be very brief. I just want to join the chairman in thanking three speakers. They've just been, I think, extremely good. And I think this is going to be one of these seminars which is going to be useful for both advanced and emerging countries. A new concept which Professor Ben has brought up. Why not have two quantified numerical targets, something which we had not thought through or not have any one of them. It reminds me of the Taylor equation once again. We will have the presentation today, the discussion today on our website by tomorrow. We'll share it with everyone. Next week, under the same G20 Task Force 5, we have the fiscal coordination. And under the fiscal coordination, we have Professor Barry Eichengreen from California joining us. And from India, we'll have Professor Govind Rao. And from London, we will have Ratin Roy join the discussion. So I would welcome you to please join us next week on Friday. The timing will be a little late because Professor Barry Eichengreen will be joining from California, the West Coast, but we'll keep you informed about it. Once again, thanks to everybody. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to the audience for joining us today. Thank you.